Millions more face Tier 3 restrictions. South Yorkshire will face the toughest COVID rules from Saturday. Among the measures, pubs and bars which don't serve food will close, and there are tight restrictions on households mixing. We'll have reaction to the latest restrictions live from Sheffield. Also this lunchtime, the Prime Minister says there will be money for Greater Manchester.
The Mayor of Greater Manchester was offered a further £60 million, which he turned down, Mr. Speaker, with no encouragement, I may say, to support from the right honourable gentleman. So I can tell the House today, Mr. Speaker, is that that cash will be distributed to the boroughs of Greater Manchester.
Labour accuse him of pitching region against region.
I really think the Prime Minister's crossed a Rubicon here, not just with the miserly way that he's treated Greater Manchester, but the grub it, take it or leave it way these local deals are being done. It's corrosive to public trust.
The Scottish Government extends its restrictions as it prepares to announce its own tier system.
Morning, got a parcel here for you, Chris. Yeah. You must have got one to collect from you today, yeah? Just get a scan for you.
Stamping out COVID queues at the post office, the Royal Mail launches a click and collect service on your doorstep.
And coming up on BBC News, Wasps get the all clear. They will face Exeter in the Premiership final this weekend, despite 11 cases of coronavirus within the club in the past week.
Good afternoon and welcome to the BBC News at 1. South Yorkshire will move into the highest level of coronavirus restrictions on Saturday. Alongside Greater Manchester, the region will join the Liverpool City region in Tier 3. Under the new rules, pubs and bars which do not serve substantial meals have to close, and there'll be further restrictions on households mixing. Making the announcement this morning, Mayor Dan Jarvis said the area will receive £41 million in extra funding. The new restrictions will apply to all 4 local authority areas in South Yorkshire: Barnsley, Doncaster, Rotherham and Sheffield. Well, Dan Johnson is in Sheffield for us now with the latest reaction. Dan.
Yes, this is another million or more people who are now affected by the highest level of local lockdown restrictions. And the Mayor of the City region here in South Yorkshire, Dan Jarvis, said that he'd accepted those tighter measures because more older people were contracting the virus here. He said the number of people with COVID in local hospitals had doubled over the last 10 days. He said there was no sign that that would relent over the coming weeks, and therefore inaction was not an option. And that means now there'll be further disruption here to social life and to business too. Even the youngest lives are disrupted by the impact of the virus and the new restrictions to control it. And that means here, playtime will soon be over.
I don't understand why soft play is included at all. For a lot of us that have either had babies in lockdown or just before lockdown, we've only just been allowed out and to meet friends, and now we're being told no, stay at home again.
I'm not sure if it's fair on all the businesses. Like, for instance, here, they are COVID secure. They've put so much in place and people are following the rules. So I don't think it's fair.
We worked really hard to keep our bank of staff on, as many people as possible through furlough, and keep giving everyone a little bit to basically keep their households ticking over. Now we're really going to struggle to keep those staff on board. We've obviously worked really hard to get customers back in and sort of getting their safety procedures right so customers have confidence in us. Well, we're going to have to start again with that.
Grown-up fun is being limited too, with betting shops closing, along with pubs that don't do food.
How do I feel about it? I think I speak for most of my staff and certainly the management team that it's devastating. You know, it's a livelihood, it's a way of life. We've had the entire business pulled from under us.
Tighter restrictions will apply across Sheffield, Rotherham, Barnsley and Doncaster from Saturday morning. Gyms can stay open, but people are being advised to travel out of South Yorkshire only for work, education or caring responsibilities. Lindsay's care responsibilities are close to home. She's got chronic asthma and her daughter is on immunosuppressant drugs.
With the situation that my family have, I'm sort of pleased that it's happened, but I wish it had happened sooner. It feels like a bit like we're in limbo. If things are getting worse, then why aren't we shielding this time? But we were the first time round. what makes the difference.
There's £41 million to support businesses here after a deal was done much more quickly and smoothly than some other cities. And the government's talking about further restrictions being applied in more places. Yes, there was some confusion here this morning about exactly what this mix of measures would be, precisely what would be closed, but it looks like everything here has been done more smoothly and with more clarity than is applied in some other cities, some other areas. But there are questions about exactly how long these measures will be in place and what the gauge is of when it will be safe to start relaxing measures again, what the figures here need to be before life can start getting back to normal. But the hope is that these measures will be enough to bring virus numbers across South Yorkshire back under control.
Dan, thank you very much. Dan Johnson there. The Prime Minister has announced that the government will be giving the boroughs of Greater Manchester an extra £60 million in funding as the region there goes into Tier 3. It comes after talks with the Mayor for Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham, collapsed yesterday. Sarah Corker reports.
These signs in Greater Manchester haven't aged well. On Friday, restrictions for the 2.8 million people living here will tighten once again. Pubs will close. Travel in and out of the area is not advised. And local leaders have demanded more funding to help the lowest paid workers who will be hit hardest by Tier 3 closures.
I think Andy Burnham has done a great job sticking up for the people of Manchester.
No, I think that it's necessary. Someone needs to listen to the people. So why not Manchester?
For 10 days, the politicians have been deadlocked. The Labour Mayor of Greater Manchester said he'd accept a support package of £65 million. The government offered 60. There was no agreement. And this was Andy Burnham finding out the news during his own press conference yesterday.
So it's going to be £20 million only, and they are going to try and pick off individual councils.
I mean, it's brutal, to be honest, isn't it? This is no way to run the country in a national crisis.
In a strongly worded letter, some Conservative MPs from Greater Manchester said Mr Burnham was putting his ego before his responsibility to those he represents and accused him of putting hundreds of thousands of people in jeopardy. This lunchtime in the Commons, the Prime Minister confirmed the £60 million package would be distributed.
Yesterday, the Mayor of Greater Manchester was offered a further £60 million, which he turned down, Mr Speaker, with no encouragement, I may say, to support from the right honourable gentleman. So I can tell the House today, Mr Speaker, is that cash will be distributed to the boroughs of Greater Manchester.
Workers affected by Tier 3 restrictions, so those employed by businesses forced to close by law, will have 2/3 of their wages paid for by the government. The hospitality sector, though, fears some businesses may not survive moving into this top tier of restrictions.
We're treading water and we seem to be playing a game at the moment every day. I don't know whether I'm opening, closing. Last week, I didn't know what tier we were going to be in. We ran all our food down, we ran all our beer down, our cask, so it wouldn't perish. And then the next day, I'm told that I need to reorder, and then I'm ordering, and then we're going to shut down again. So it's playing a bit of a game, really, at the moment, and it's affecting everybody.
Greater Manchester is the first area to be forced into England's highest level of alert against the wishes of local leaders who say they're standing up for an area already suffering after months of local lockdown. Sarah Corker, BBC News in Manchester.
Boris Johnson and Keir Starmer have clashed over the government's local coronavirus strategy in England. Sir Keir Starmer accused the government of bargaining with people's lives, while the Prime Minister said no other country in Europe had given as much support as his government. Our political correspondent Nick Eardley reports.
Why is it so chaotic? Are you shortchanging the people of Manchester?
Big questions for the government over its local restrictions plan. After a breakdown in talks with Greater Manchester and warnings of a grim winter ahead, many have questioned what economic support would be available and what the exit plan is, as many employees face weeks with their work closed.
Their rent and their mortgage won't be lower, their food and their heating bills won't be lower, and that could last for months. Why can't the Prime Minister and the Chancellor understand this? Stop bargaining with people's lives, stop dividing communities and provide the support that's needed in Manchester.
The government says it's offering proportionate funding to all areas and that Manchester would get the money offered yesterday, £60 million distributed to local boroughs.
There is no other country in Europe, Mr. Speaker, where so much support, so much help has been given to the population to get through this crisis, and we will continue to do that.
But will local measures be enough? Labour is calling for a short lockdown across England.
The Prime Minister was too slow in the first phase of this pandemic. He's being too slow again. We cannot repeat this mistake. Will he act in the public interest and take the opportunity to put in place a circuit break this Friday?
He can't say how many circuit breakers he thinks would be necessary. He can't say how long they would go on. He can't say how much damage they would do to the UK economy and to people's mental health, Mr. Speaker. We, on the other hand, want to go on with our commonsensical approach.
That approach, though, has not always been easy. The government's policy of local restrictions was designed to allow for rapid interventions and make sure the local leaders were on board, both to share expertise and responsibility. But in truth, many of the talks have proved slow, and the situation in Greater Manchester shows the local support can't be taken for granted. Getting local leaders and political opponents on the same page hasn't always been easy. This phase of the pandemic is proving a lot less consensual. Nick Early, BBC News, Westminster.
Our political correspondent Ian Watson is at the Houses of Parliament for us, and so much for a united front against COVID-19.
Yes, we have a very interesting political story, wouldn't it, Simon, if we weren't in the midst of a pandemic and we're getting all this wrangling going on. I think we're seeing increasing divisions, firstly at the national level, very clear differences in approach from Keir Starmer for Labour, calling for a short, sharp, England-wide lockdown, and for Boris Johnson defending his regional approach, but also increasing tensions now between central and local governments. Let me run you through three brief examples. First of all, Greater Manchester, we've talked a lot about that. Boris Johnson suggesting that £60 million in support would go to what he called the boroughs of Greater Manchester. Some see that as an attempt to bypass the Mayor for Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham, and Keir Starmer accused Boris Johnson of pitching one council against the other. Secondly, there's a question of a bailout for Transport for London. Boris Johnson described the Mayor of London, the Labour Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, as bankrupt. Sadiq Khan, for his part, is suggesting that Boris Johnson is being vindictive. And then let's go to South Yorkshire. Now, again, it's been reported that that deal went quite smoothly, apparently not as smoothly as all that, because the leader of one of the council areas, Rotherham, has suggested that they were given a take-it-or-leave-it deal, and had the government been listening, they would have got more support. And in a meeting with a health minister, a Labour MP for the area, Sarah Champion, was asking for clarification as to whether people in the region could go on holiday. The answer she got was firstly yes, then no, then we'll get back to you. So a consequence of this regional approach, if you like, is it does tend in the short term at least to lead to confusion, and it leads to wrangling. But what Boris Johnson says is if you take a national approach, you're going to end up punishing areas with low prevalence of the virus, and that's the wrong way to deal with the crisis.
Ian, thank you very much. Coronavirus restrictions in Scotland, which saw the closure of pubs and restaurants in the Central Belt area and a 6 p.m. indoor hospitality curfew elsewhere, are to be extended until the 2nd of November. There'll then be a tier system introduced. Well, Lorna Gordon is in Glasgow for us, and worrying figures published again.
Yeah, there really were. Those restrictions, which were due to expire on Monday, have been extended for another week. There will be financial support offered to businesses affected, but the industry body, the Scottish Licensed Trade Association, has commented. They say they're extremely disappointed by the extension of these restrictions and that they think the damage could be irreparable. Scotland's First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, acknowledged those worries in her comments at her daily briefing. She said she knew the restrictions are very unwelcome, harsh for businesses, harsh emotionally. None, she said, are being taken lightly, but it is all about trying to save lives. And in the last 24 hours, as you say, there's been some extremely sobering figures coming out. 28 people have died who have tested positive for the virus. That's the highest number of deaths since the 21st of May. Nicola Sturgeon said that those relate, of course, to people who were probably infected 2 or 3 weeks ago. And she also said, although it's still very early days, she does believe believe that the restrictions, coupled with earlier restrictions on household gatherings indoors, seem to be making a difference.
I can confirm that we have decided to extend these measures for a further week. This is first and foremost a public health decision. Although we have grounds for cautious optimism that the restrictions are having an effect, the clinical advice to Cabinet is that it would not be safe to lift them as early as Monday. But secondly, the extension allows us to transition more smoothly to the new level system that we hope will be introduced on the 2nd of November.
So the current restrictions being rolled over till the 2nd of November, when a new strategic framework, a traffic-like system, will be introduced here in Scotland. And we know that there are discussions about potentially that being a 5-tier system. We'll hear more about that on Friday.
Lorna, thank you very much, Lorna Gordon. Gyms will be able to reopen across Liverpool after the government bowed to pressure to bring it in line with other areas under Tier 3 measures. They were ordered to close when the area was placed into the very high level of coronavirus restrictions. Liverpool Metro Mayor Steve Rotherham said they would now be allowed to reopen, but soft play areas would close. The UK did not have the exact measures in place to deal with the coronavirus pandemic. That's according to the former head of the Civil Service. Lord Sedwill, who left his job last month, said there is a genuine question about whether the UK could have been better prepared. In his first television interview since leaving Number 10, he's been speaking to our political editor, Laura Kuenssberg.
Leaders everywhere have been challenged by the pandemic, but what do you think the government got wrong in the early months trying to handle it?
Well, we don't yet know. I mean, in the end, the inquiry, and whenever it comes, will have to address two big questions, I think. One is, were the right decisions taken at the right time? The second big question, though, I think, which in a sense has been less exposed, is what were the capabilities that the state had to deploy against this?
Is the government really robust going into this?
Well, I think that goes to this point about what were our capabilities as a whole. And clearly, although we had exercised and prepared for pandemic threats, we didn't have in place the exact measures, and we hadn't rehearsed the exact measures for a pandemic, for a disease of the kind that the challenge COVID-19 presented.
During that tense period, it also then emerged that the Prime Minister's chief advisor had gone to County Durham. Many people in the country were absolutely outraged by that. Do you think that Dominic Cummings should have quit over that?
I don't think it's for me to say whether or not he should quit. It was a mistake. Whether everyone should quit every time they make a mistake, I don't think it's right. But it clearly undermined the government's sort of coherent narrative about people following the rules.
During that period and in the kind of immediate aftermath of phase 1 of the pandemic, there was, however, briefing against you, and then you left government. I mean, what really happened and what was that like?
Briefing of that kind is really damaging. It's damaging to trust between officials and ministers. It's damaging when it happens, of course, between ministers, because often it's that too. And what that means is, within government, it undermines the candour with which people can operate. So it is damaging to good governance, and those responsible should recognise the damage they're doing, even if they're indulging themselves in some tactical, short-term tactical ploy.
But what do you think then the government is trying to do with the civil service? And are you comfortable with how they're going about it?
There is definitely a narrative out there, particularly around the senior civil service. I don't think that's helpful. Of course, I'm troubled when we see attacks on the civil service, attacks on its integrity, attacks on its capability, because I just don't believe those are fair, and we can't really answer back.
Lord Sedwill talking to our political editor, Laura Kuenssberg. It's coming up to 1:20, our top story this lunchtime. Millions more face Tier 3 restrictions. South Yorkshire will face the toughest COVID rules from Saturday. Still to come, the vital clues that might tell you if you're liable to suffer from long COVID. 1 in 20 of us are at risk.
Coming up on BBC News, a lifeline for the National League. A £10 million package from the National Lottery will be allocated to clubs based on attendance, with 7 former league clubs receiving the biggest share.
Scientists believe they've found a way to identify people who are more likely to develop so-called long COVID. Most people recover from the virus within 11 days, but the study shows 1 in 20 are sick for at least 8 weeks. The research suggests being older and having 5 or more symptoms in the first week of the infection increase the risk of a longer recovery. Our health correspondent Catherine Burns reports.
Vicky Bourne says she was the fittest she'd ever been at the start of this year, from ziplining on holiday to going to the gym several times a week. But she got COVID in March and says she's had wave after wave of illness ever since.
Ankles or my wrists will suddenly get very sore and swell up. I lost my sense of taste and smell again. It just went completely. I've definitely got some brain fog. I get really wheezy and breathless, and I have to use an inhaler twice a day now.
Researchers think thousands of people in the UK are going through something similar. They asked volunteers to log their health on the COVID Symptoms Study app and found that most said they were back to normal in 11 days or less. They estimate that 1 in 7 people who get ill with coronavirus will be sick for more than a month, which is how they define long COVID. Then longer COVID. They think 1 in 20 are affected for more than 8 weeks, and that 1 in 45 are likely to be sick for more than 12 weeks. Today, the Health Secretary met doctors and patients at a long COVID clinic and heard how hard some people have found it to get help.
There's just not enough facilities.
Yeah.
It's taken me 8.5 months to be seen by a person.
Yeah.
This is my first time.
Yeah.
There's no facilities in my area.
Yeah.
Matt Hancock says the government doesn't fully know how many people have long COVID.
We're putting the money in, and I'm absolutely determined that everybody can get the treatment that they need. And we're also putting the support in for research.
Scientists have now come up with a tool that can predict in 7 out of 10 cases who is likely to go on to develop long COVID.
Having more than 5 different symptoms in the first week was one of the key risk factors. The other ones were actually age and older people being slightly more likely to have long COVID, particularly the over 50s group. And the last thing was being female.
Well done, Nick!
Not everyone fits the profile though. Nick, seen here in the black and white top, runs about 50 races a year and is in the top 1,000 runners in the country, or was. Now he can't run 5k.
It's definitely made me feel that sort of weakness and that like inability to cope with my day-to-day life, and it's been hard to take that as a 28-year-old man, really, because you're expecting sort of to be in the peak of your life, and I really was, at the best running level I'd ever been at. I was really enjoying it, and then it just all sort of gets taken away from you.
He says the hardest part is not knowing when or if he's going to get back the health and fitness that he lost. Catherine Burns, BBC News.
Those receiving the state pension can expect to see a 2.5% rise next year after the latest inflation figures were released. The September figure is used to calculate pensions and business rates. It was pushed higher to 0.5% as the end of the government's Eat Out to Help Out scheme saw restaurant and cafe prices bounce back. Let's talk to our economics correspondent, Andy Verity. And was that the main reason for this, Andy?
It was a big part of the reason for it, Simon, yes. Inflation at 0.5% is well below the Bank of England's target of 2%, and it's the lowest it's been in about 4 years, apart from the last count when it got down to 0.3. Back in 2016, we had falling oil prices. And similarly, in the midst of this crisis, there's less demand because a lot of economies are shrinking for world commodities like oil. And that's one of the reasons that inflation's come down. But also, Eat Out to Help Out, as you said, the end of those discounts in September for most restaurants, some carried on, but that meant that that downward effect on inflation was removed. But what it really means, this very non-threatening inflation number, is that the Bank of England now really doesn't have any reason at all to even contemplate raising interest rates anytime in the near future. And it does have reason to create £100 billion that the government needs to borrow in order to get us through the pandemic, because they can say this is an economic stimulus, inflation's low, we can do this without the risk of inflation. But it's interesting, if you look at the chart, you can see how inflation's still really low compared to how it has been. And the cheapness of borrowing is really important because we're borrowing so much. if you look at the chart for how much we've borrowed, then you see that in just 6 months, we've borrowed £208 billion in the public sector. That's about 4 times as much as we borrowed in the whole of the previous financial year. So we're on course for a very large borrowing number indeed. And that puts something else you said at the beginning of this item into a new light. The state pension is due, as you said, to rise by 2.5%. That's 5 times the rate of inflation. Now, the public finances are in a mess now. And similarly, a lot of people of working age are seeing their earnings go down. So there's a big question now as to whether it's fair to give pensioners an increase of 5 times the rate of inflation.
Andy Verity, thank you very much. The European Union's chief negotiator, Michel Barnier, has insisted that a trade deal with the UK is still possible and says the EU will work right up until the last day to secure a satisfactory outcome. Mr Barnier told the European Parliament that the EU's door was open for future negotiations, but preparations must also be made for a no-deal scenario. Downing Street has said it will only resume negotiations when the EU fundamentally changes its position. Protests against police brutality in Nigeria have turned violent, with soldiers reportedly opening fire on demonstrators in the country's biggest city, Lagos. There are reports that at least 20 people have been killed, with more wounded. The Nigerian military have denied involvement. The government has appealed for calm and promised a full inquiry. Some viewers may find images in Caroline Hawley's report distressing.
A peaceful protest was how it began. Large crowds of people came out to raise their voices against police brutality, despite a curfew. What happened later when the security forces turned up has shocked the nation. Dusk fell to the sound of live gunfire. Eyewitnesses say soldiers were firing directly at them. One described it as pandemonium. People took shelter where they could to try to keep safe.
Nigerian government, they are shooting, no. They are shooting at us. They are shooting.
This morning, the governor of Lagos visited some of the wounded. An investigation has been promised as international condemnation mounts, including from celebrities like Beyoncé, Rihanna, and from one Man U footballer.
I can't keep quiet anymore for what is going on back home in Nigeria. I would say Nigerian government, you guys are a shame to the world. For killing your own citizens, sending military to the street to kill unarmed protesters because they are protesting for their rights is uncalled for.
The protests in Nigeria began earlier this month. Young people demanding the abolition of a notorious police unit. The Special Anti-Robbery Squad, seen here in footage posted on YouTube, is accused of torture, extortion and even extrajudicial killings. It's been disbanded, but the anger over police brutality here has not gone away. And what happened in Lagos last night is likely to only fuel the anti-government fury. The president has appealed for calm. He says police reforms are gathering pace. But the question for Nigeria, Africa's biggest economy, the continent's most populous country, is what next? Caroline Hawley, BBC News.
Here, Royal Mail has launched a new parcel pickup service in which it will collect parcels and mail from people's doorsteps. The firm is trying to capitalise on a rise in online shopping, which has been accelerated by the coronavirus crisis. Though not the only company to offer the service, Royal Mail hopes the new scheme will help deliver a brighter future. Fiona Lambden reports.
Posties have been delivering for decades, but for the first time in 168 years. From today, they're now collecting parcels from your doorstep as well.
I've also got one to collect from you today, yeah.
A direct swap. Chris went online, paid an extra 72 pence, and the parcel he's sending is now already on its way.
Well, Bristol has been trialling this for over a month, and they've been getting on average about 100 parcels a day. The largest they can take is twice the size of cabin luggage.
It's easy to sort of be at home and get someone to collect it because they have to queue up 2 meters distance and everything else, so it's a bit difficult for people to stand out half an hour, 40 minutes just to deliver one parcel, when it's easier for us to just come at the door, 2-minute job and just pick it up and go.
What sort of people have taken it up so far?
We've had a whole range of customers. We've had the young students, we've had elderly, and we've also had new parents who just can't get out of the house for COVID reasons or disability reasons. And they absolutely love the service that we're providing.
It feels a bit weird to sort of take parcels off people when we're normally giving them. So actually to take them off them, it's a bit of a change, but it's a nice change for the customer as well as us.
Since the advent of email, the number of letters this sorting office sees has halved.
We were always looking at change before COVID hit, and we were very much slowly becoming a parcel company. And now since COVID, as you can see, we have lost a lot of letters, and a lot of the large letters as well. And we're now moving into what we class as parcels. We'll obviously give the customer many more options for us to come and collect it direct from them. And we can obviously now put it into the system and we'll just send it on its journey.
But Royal Mail is joining an already crowded market, with rivals like DPD, Hermes and DHL offering collections too. It's a huge day for the Postal Service, arguably some of the biggest changes seen since the launch of the postbox back in 1852. Fiona Lambdin, BBC News.
Let's have a look at the weather, the forecast now with Stav Daneo. Stav.
Thank you, Simon. Good afternoon to you. It's been a very wet morning and end of the night as well across parts of England and Wales. A lot of standing water around, some localised flooding too. I've got a number of weather station rainfall amounts, in fact, from last night through this morning across southern England. You can see nearly an inch of rain. The rain's still falling, of course. And parts of northern western Scotland have been very wet over the last couple of days. And you can see where the wet weather has been over the last few hours. Again, northern western Scotland, where it's quite windy. And this mass of cloud and rain affecting a good portion of England and Wales, which contains the remnants of what was Storm Barbara, named by the Spanish Met Service. So it continues wet across many central and southern areas through the afternoon. Fairly strong winds, gale force winds running through the English Channel, affecting the very far southeast for a while. And it stays wet across northern Scotland, windy here as well. In between, variable amounts of cloud, a few showers, but for many of us, it's going to be quite mild, not quite as mild as it was yesterday. Now, as we head through tonight, that rain begins to peter out across England and Wales. It leaves a legacy of some showers, one or two patches of cloud, but it stays quite wet and windy, though, across much of central and northern Scotland, with single figure values in the north, double figure values in the south. Another fairly mild night to come. Now, this complex area of low pressure eventually starts to move away on Thursday and allows this brief ridge of high pressure to nose in from the Atlantic. So that should start to settle things down. But it does start off fairly cloudy Thursday. A few showers dotted around, but it stays quite cloudy and wet and windy for northern and eastern Scotland. Slowly improving here later in the day. But for Northern Ireland, much of England and Wales, we should see increasing amounts of sunshine and the winds turning lighter into the afternoon. It's slightly cooler air mass across the board, so the low teens Celsius for most, but in the sunshine in the southeast, we could see 15 or 16 degrees. Now, as we head on through Thursday night, we start to see the next frontal system pushing in to western areas. You can see it here, pushing in off the Atlantic, closely set isobars, so the wind's going to increase as well. It'll be bringing some patchy, fairly heavy rain to northern and western areas for Friday morning. As it continues to move eastwards, it will tend to fizzle out to patchy showers. But in behind it, we'll see sunshine and showers, and some of these will merge together to produce longer spells of rain. And it will be a windy day, winds gusting in excess of 30-40 miles an hour across the northwest. A little bit cooler feel as well to things. Into the weekend, though, it looks very windy indeed. Widespread gales for Saturday. It will be quite mild, though, again, given a little bit of sunshine, but there will be some heavy rain and showers around. As we move on into Sunday, it turns a bit cooler again. Still windy, but not quite as windy on Sunday as what we'll have on Saturday. That's how it's looking, Simon.
Stav, thank you very much for that. And a reminder of our main story. Millions more face Tier 3 restrictions. South Yorkshire will face the toughest COVID rules from Saturday. That's all from the BBC News at 1. On BBC One, we now join the BBC's news teams where you are. From me, good afternoon.